So today's video is going to be on AWS Private Link. AWS Private Link. Yeah. So what AWS Private Link is? So AWS Private Link is a service in AWS which helps with providing or creating a private connection between two different VPCs, right? To access an endpoint which a provider VPC will provide, right? So let's suppose we have a VPC in our AWS account, and there's another VPC which is in another AWS account, and let's suppose this particular VPC B hosted an API within this VPC, and from our VPC we would like to access this particular APIs, right? So to access this particular APIs, what we can do is we can create a private connection between these two VPCs so that our traffic from our VPC will not be traveling over the internet. So to avoid this particular traffic to be traveling over the internet, we can create a private link connection between two different VPCs to access a particular endpoint, right? Remember this thing, to access a particular endpoint. So this is a particular API, and this particular API would be accessible over a endpoint. Let's suppose any example.com or api.example.com, something like that, right? So that would be the endpoint. So to access a particular endpoint, we can create a VPC, AWS private link connections between two different VPCs. Now, most of you would have been thinking that the same thing we would be able to achieve using a VPC pairing connection, right? We can create a VPC pairing between these two VPCs, and we can access those APIs using that VPC pairing connection. Yes, you can do that, but for that you would have to be in full control of both of these VPCs, right? So that you would be able to create a VPC pairing connection, so you can manage the route tables, etc. And with VPC pairing connection, you are giving a complete access to a particular subnets, right? So anyone from a VPC A would be able to access any of the EC2 instance, any of the RDS in VPC B. And let's suppose this particular VPC B is a producer, or let's suppose it's a service provider, right? So this particular service provider would never want us to be able to access their EC2 instances, their resources in that particular subnet, right? So that at that point, we can't consider creating a VPC pairing connections, right? So private link will allow us to access a particular endpoint, right? So let's suppose our service provider has an API, and they just wanted us to access only those APIs. So we can create a VPC, we can create a AWS private link in that case, and we can just access that particular endpoint, and we won't be able to access their EC2 instances, any other resources in that particular subnet. We can only access those endpoints. So for that purpose, we can create a VPC private link, right? So now let's see how we can create a VPC private link. So before going to AWS console, let me give you an example what AWS services we will be creating. So I'll be having two AWS accounts. So this would be AWS account, let's say A, and this would be AWS account B. So I'll create two AWS account, and within these AWS accounts, I'll create a VPC. So both AWS account will have a VPC, and let's consider this particular B AWS account to be a service provider. So service provider. So we will provide a service, let's say Nginx service. So we'll host an Nginx EC2 machine, and this particular Nginx EC2 machine will be accessible over an endpoint. So we'll create an endpoint, and this particular endpoint we would try to access from our VPC A using a private link connection. So let's see in AWS console what are the AWS resources that we will create for this purpose, right? Okay, so I'm in my AWS console now, and in this console we have two AWS accounts. So I'll be using both of these AWS accounts to set up this demo. So account 2, I'll be using this account 2 to set up a service provider where we will be setting up a VPC endpoint service, and account 1 would be the account where we will be setting up a VPC endpoint, right? So first, let me open both of these accounts, and what I'll do is, so this is account 1. I'll just create a group over here in browser so that we can easily differentiate between both of these accounts. So this is account 1, and this is account 2. I'll just add it to a group named as account. So yeah, so in account 2, first let's set up a VPC endpoint service, and to do that, what we are going to do is, first let's create a VPC. We don't have any VPC in both of these AWS accounts, so let's quickly set up a VPC here. So in account 2, I'll go to VPC. If you know how to create a VPC and everything, you can skip and you can move forward. So over here in Singapore region, I'll be creating this VPC. So for this demo, I'll use two different regions. So VPC endpoint service, so the Nginx API kind of thing, we will be deploying in Singapore region, and that particular endpoint service and that particular API will be accessible in our account 1 in Mumbai region. So we are using two different regions here. So in account 2, I'll set up a VPC. So let me just quickly do that. Create a VPC. I'll give it a name. Let's say Nginx service provider. I'll use the same CAD block here. I'll not change it. Two public subnets, two private subnets. I'll deploy one NAT gateway, and there will be no VPC endpoint. I don't want to have a VPC endpoint for S3 gateway at the moment. I'll just quickly create it. And the same steps I'll perform in account 1. I'll quickly create a VPC here. Create a VPC. I'll give it a name. Let's say Balvinder. I'll use the same CIDR block. That's not an issue. Two public subnet, two private. One is one NAT gateway. In one is the no VPC endpoint. Create VPC. Cool. So yeah, let's wait till this VPCs are getting provisioned. In the meantime, these VPCs are getting provisioned. I'll quickly show you what we are trying to achieve here is, so we have two AWS accounts, right? So this is account B, and we will be using Singapore region here, and this is going to be account A, and we will be using Mumbai region here, right? So within this account, so in Singapore account, we will have a VPC, and within this VPC, we'll be creating an Nginx service. So on an EC2 machine, I'll create an Nginx. I'll deploy an Nginx package and we'll spin it up, right? And this Nginx service, let's assume this particular Nginx service is our APIs, which needs to be accessible from account 1. Yeah, so this Nginx API would be accessible, should be accessible in our VPC in account A. So what we would need is, we would be creating an NLB in front of that Nginx machine. So it's not necessary to have an EC2 machine over here. It could be EKS clusters as well, like our applications running behind an EKS cluster, or it could be ECS, right? Anything. But those services should be behind a network load balancer, right? So to be able to successfully provision a VPC endpoint service, those services should be behind a network load balancer, right? So it would be something like this. So over here we will have a VPC endpoint service. So it would be something like this, right? And in our account 1, we will have a VPC endpoint. Something like this, right? So any connection request, so both this VPC endpoint and VPC endpoint service will be would be connected to each other using AWS network. So it would be behind a private link network, which is AWS network, right? And this particular VPC endpoint service, behind this VPC endpoint service, there will be a network load balancer, and this network load balancer will be routing the traffic to EC2 machine, or it could be, if our application or APIs are hosted behind an EKS, so it could be EKS, like the load balancers, application load balancers. Yeah, it could be an application load balancer as well behind the NLB, right? So, and behind this ALB, there could be like our ingresses, like EKS ingress or something like that, right? If I'll make it a bit more larger, so it would be something like this. And behind this ALB, like we can have couple of EC2 machines like EKS nodes, right? And this ALB will be forwarding all those traffic to those particular EKS nodes. something like this. But the thing is, we would need a network load balancer here. So it could be a network load balancer or a gateway load balancer. So VPC endpoint service, we can create it behind like behind a network load balancer and a gateway load balancer, right? So for this purpose, we will be using a network load balancer. Yeah. So this is something which we will be going to deploy in our AWS account. So I'll be using EC2 machine here in this part because I don't have any EKS cluster, ECS or ALBs at the moment. So this is something I'm not going to use. But yeah, you can use this setup if you have your applications running on EKS, yeah, ECS or ALB. Yeah, so this is what we are going to achieve now. So let's see, our VPCs should have been provisioned now. Yeah, so VPCs are up and running in both of the AWS accounts. So let's set up our API first. So in our AWS account, what I'll do is I'll go to EC2 machines. I'll quickly spin up an EC2 machine, and yeah, let's install Nginx in that machine. So I'll do launch instance. I'll give it a name, Nginx service, Amazon Linux, T2 micro, fine. I not use any key pair. Okay, so over here I'll select the VPC that I just created, and it should be private subnet, right? For the security group, I think there should be, okay, there's a default security group. I'll create the one, so it should be Nginx service. I'll give it a name, Nginx service, and this should be on HTTP. Okay, I'll remove this rule, add a rule. It should be HTTP. Where is the HTTP on port 80, and the source CIDR would be our VPC. I would like to have the VPC CIDR here. And in advanced details, if I'll go, I would have to select one IAM role so that I would be able to access this particular EC2 machine using session manager. So I don't have an IAM role at the moment. I'll quickly create one. If I'll go to IAM, roles, I'll create a role. It should be EC2, and the use case would be system manager. This is the default AWS managed policy which we can use. I'll give it a name, EC2 role. You can skip this part if you know how to spin up EC2 instances, how to spin up the application. If you already have API running, so you can skip forward. Yep. So the role is created. I'll use this IAM role here. Yep, this one, and I'll launch the instance. So it might take not more than 1 minute. So let's wait. Let's give it a try if we are able to access this one. Session manager connect. Okay, yeah, we are able to SSH into the machine. So what I'll do is I'll install Nginx, yum install Nginx -y. Cool. So I have got Nginx here. I'll do systemctl start Nginx dot service. Yep, cool. And if I'll do for localhost, I should be able to see some page. Yeah, welcome to Nginx. This is fine. So we have our APIs up and running, and this is not an actual API, but yeah, we can assume this is an API. Yeah, just for the demo purpose. So now the next thing is, so we have our Nginx API up and running. Next thing is, we would need this particular EC2 machine or our APIs to be behind a network load balancer, right? So I'll spin up a network load balancer now. So I'll go to load balancers. There's no load balancer at the moment. I'll create one network load balancer. I'll give it a name, Nginx service. It needs to be in the VPC that I created. So, and the subnet should be the private. This is also private. This is fine. And in terms of security group, I'll choose the default one for now. Once the load balancer is up and running, I'll change the security group. And in terms of target group, I don't have any, so I'll quickly create one target group here. So this target group would be instance. The target type would be instance because we are dealing with the EC2 machine here. But if you have application load balancer, you can select the target type as an application load balancer as well, right? I'll give it a name Nginx EC2 machine, and it should be our VPC health check. I'll choose the default one and then next. So this is our EC2 machine. So our Nginx is running on port 80. So I'll select port 80 here, which is default. Include as pending below, create target group. Nice. So our target group has been created. If I'll do a refresh here, I could see it here. Nice. And global accelerator, it's not required. Yeah, I'll just create a load balancer now. So now let's wait for this load balancer to be up and running. I just realized is we have provisioned the network load balancer in as a public facing, whereas we would need it to be a private network load balancer. So I'll just delete this load balancer here and we'll provision a new one in private subnet. Okay, so we have our EC2 machine behind the target group healthy, and our load balancer is also in active state, which means this part is also completed. And now the next thing is we would have to create a VPC endpoint service here. So I'll go to VPC here, and within VPC page I will be able to see endpoint services. Select this and create a VPC endpoint service. I'll give it a name Nginx service. So it needs to be a network load balancer. So behind the network load balancer, or it could be a gateway. So in our case, we are using a network load balancer. So I'll select this one, and this is the network load balancer that we have. I'll select it, and supported region. Yeah. So this is important. So in my case, this is in Mumbai region, account A, which will access our Nginx service. That is in account A using Mumbai region, right? So it needs to be, so the supported region would be for this particular VPC endpoint services, Mumbai, right? So from here, I'll select Mumbai as a supported region. And because this is getting provisioned in Singapore, we don't have to select Singapore here. Acceptance required, this needs to be selected. So there are two things. The one thing is, if you want your particular VPC endpoint services to be accessible, like anyone would be able to create a VPC endpoint service and would be able to establish a network, you don't have to accept that particular connection request. So that's the one thing. But that doesn't mean that like anyone would be able to create an VPC endpoint service from any of the AWS account and would be able to connect to that particular endpoint service. No, you will have to authorize that particular AWS account. So if I'll authorize an AWS account, let's say account A, in this particular VPC endpoint service, right? So within this account A, if I'll create n number of VPC endpoint services, let's say this particular endpoint service, I'll create one more endpoint service. So I'll create endpoint here. I would be able to establish a connection without a acceptance required to this particular endpoint service. So this is what this particular part means. And I'll create the VPC endpoint service here. Good. So now the VPC endpoint service, will take a look. This is in pending state. Let's wait for it to be green. Okay, it's available now. And over here, if you'll see allowed principal, so this is where we would be able to allow any AWS accounts to be able to create a VPC endpoint, right? To be able to create a connection with this particular endpoint service. So over here, I'll just allow my AWS account 1. I'll copy the account ID here. I'll put it in here, and it needs to be ARN:AWS:IAM: account ID, and then root. Allow. So now what we have done is, within this VPC endpoint service, we have authorized this particular account A. So now from this account A, any VPC endpoint connection can be created, and that particular connection needs to be accepted in this particular VPC endpoint service. I'll show you that how it can be done. So allowed principal, this is allowed. Yeah, cool. So in account 2, most of the things are completed. There's one more thing which is pending. We have created a network load balancer, but we haven't changed the security group here. This is the default security group. So I'll quickly create one security group for load balancer. I'll give it a name, Nginx LB. Copy, paste. It needs to be Nginx service provider. Inbound rule should be like it should allow HTTP quantity, and the request would be like 10. I'll put the VPC CIDR here, and yeah, create security group. And in load balancer, I'll just quickly change this one, NLB. Save. So yeah, in terms of VPC endpoint service, we have done all of the things in account B. We have created the endpoint service as well. Let me just have a look again. Cool. Yeah, this looks good. Now let's jump into account 1, into this account, and in this account we will be creating one VPC endpoint, right? So let's quickly go to our VPC, and again in private link endpoint, I'll create an endpoint connection, and I'll give it a name. Let's say Nginx service account B. This is in account B, right? So the endpoint types could be multiple. Like if we want to create an VPC endpoint with AWS services, let's say Prometheus or some other AWS services, we can use AWS service endpoint. So it will be an interface endpoint where you would be able to communicate to AWS services over the AWS network without traveling over the internet. And if we have any partner services, we can select this partner services. If we are purchasing something from AWS marketplace, we can create a VPC endpoint using this marketplace type. Similarly, we will be using this for this demo because we have our endpoint service set up in another AWS account in another VPC. So we can just select this one, and this is the service name. So service name is something which we would be able to get from account B where we have created the service, right? So I'll go to endpoint services, and this is the service name. So I'll copy this and paste it here. And if I'll do verify service, it will fail because this service isn't available in Mumbai region. This is in Singapore region, right? In account B, we have created the service in Singapore. So I'll have to select enable cross region endpoint. I'll have to select the Singapore region here because this is in Singapore. And if I'll do verify service again, so this is verified. It means this service exists in Singapore. And from here, I'll select the VPC. So this needs to be the VPC. Enable DNS name. I'm not going to select it now. I'll show you how we can do it later in this video. And over here we would need to select the subnets. But why is this grayed out? I'm not sure. No subnet selected. I've selected the VPC here. Is there something I'm missing? I'm not sure why this one is grayed out, but we would need to select the subnets here. Okay, let's see. I'll create the endpoint and we'll see if I would be able to edit the endpoint and would be able to select the subnets here. And in terms of security group, I'm choosing the default for now, but I'll change this security group as of once this endpoint is up and running. So I'll create the endpoint. So there are two things pending for this endpoint. One is the subnet. We need to select the private subnets, and we would need to change the security group. Yeah, so over here, as you can see, this is pending acceptance because when we created this endpoint service here, we have selected the option where it is acceptance required to yes. That means we would need to accept this particular VPC endpoint connection request. So let's wait. It should pop up here. Yeah, here it is, pending acceptance, and I'll just accept this connection request. Accept. Cool. So this is accepted. I'll go to account 1 again. Okay, so it has taken a couple of minutes, but yeah, as we can see, our VPC endpoint is in available state, but we still won't be able to access it because this is in isn't part of the subnet, so there is no subnet. So what I'll do is I'll just add the subnets here. Okay, so this is the private subnet, right? Yeah, cool. Modify subnets. In the meantime, this is in pending state again. I'll create one security group again for this particular endpoint. So I'll go to the security group tab. I'll create a security group. I'll give it a name. Let's say Nginx service VPC endpoint security group. Copy paste. This needs to be in VPC, and as part of the inbound traffic, it needs to allow HTTP on port 80 from our VPC range. 16. Nice. Great. Once this is again in pending state, let's wait again. Yeah, so this is in available state now, and I'll just change the security group again, and this needs to be this one. Modify. Yep, cool. So we have set up our VPC endpoint here as well. Now the next thing is we would be able to access, like if I have an EC2 machine in our account A, I should be able to access this particular Nginx service using my VPC endpoint, right? So if I'll take a look into this endpoint, I have this DNS name, which is AWS managed DNS names, right? So I'll just copy this DNS name and I'll try to access this particular endpoint from my EC2 machine. So instead of spinning up an EC2 machine here, what I can do is I can spin up a Cloud Shell here. It could be a Cloud Shell, but it needs to be in the same VPC, right? And I would be able to access that particular endpoint. So this particular endpoint, this is DNS name provided by AWS. So we will be using this one. So what I'll do is I'll spin up a Cloud Shell here. And the one important thing that we need to make sure is this particular Cloud Shell should be in our VPC. So by default, it isn't part of our VPC. So what I'll do is I'll just create an VPC environment. I'll give it a name, Balwinder. I'll select the VPC. It needs to be in private subnet. I'll select the private subnet, and security group. I can create one more for my Cloud Shell. Security group. And create security group. I'll give it a name. Let's say Cloud Shell. Needs to be in my VPC. No inbound traffic is fine. Outbound traffic should be allowed to all. Great. And if I'll just create again, create Cloud Shell, Balwinder. It needs to be in this VPC private subnet, and the security group would be Cloud Shell. This one. Great. So what will happen if I'll if I'll just do a curl request on this particular endpoint, the request will go to this endpoint that we have created, and this endpoint is connected to this particular VPC endpoint service, and this endpoint service, behind this particular endpoint service, there's a network load balancer, and there's our API hosted over there, right? So we should be able to access this particular Nginx service using AWS Private link. Okay, so I have my Cloud Shell, so I'll try curl and copy this DNS name, paste, enter. Cool. Yeah, see, I'm able to access my Nginx web page. So this is happening over AWS Private Link network, right? So now this is how we can set up a VPC private link connection in AWS. So now there's another thing. Let's talk about that. Related to private DNS, we can also enable a private DNS. Let's suppose we do not want our this API to be accessible on this AWS managed DNS, right? Instead, I would like to have this particular Nginx service to be accessible on, let's say, nginx.deploymasters.com domain, right? So for that, I can create a private DNS for this particular VPC endpoint service. So how we can do that is we can go to our account 2, where we have this VPC endpoint service. So I'll just quickly edit this VPC endpoint service, and if I'll see here, modify private DNS name, I can just associate a private DNS name here. I can name it like nginx.deploymasters.com, right? Save changes. Now this needs a verification, domain verification, like this particular domain deploymaster.com. Do I own this domain? If yes, I should be able to add this DNS verification txt record, right? So what I'll do is I'll quickly get my DNS name, like my DNS access, and I'll quickly update these records and see if I get a verified status here or not. So I'll pause the video here, and I'll continue once this DNS name is verified. Cool. So here, as you can see, my domain verification status is verified. I have verified my domain, like I'm the owner of this domain. So I have created this txt record in my DNS and it's verified. So if I'll go to my account A and if I'll try to do curl nginx.deploymasters.com, I won't be able to see any result, right? Why? Because we have created the private DNS here, like we have enabled the private DNS this stage. If I zoom in a bit, yeah. So private DNS is enabled here, right? But this private DNS needs to be enabled in our VPC endpoint as well. So here we would need to enable our private DNS, right? So what I'll do is I'll just quickly go to my AWS account 1 in endpoint. This is my endpoint, VPC endpoint. I'll just modify a private DNS. I'll have to enable this particular checkbox, enable for this endpoint, like modify private DNS settings, and we would need to enable it, right? Save changes. It might take like a couple of minutes to update the endpoint, and let's see. Yeah, this is in pending state again. Let's wait again for a couple of minutes to be able to access that particular DNS. Okay, so this is in available state again, and as you can see here, private DNS enabled, which is yes to my VPC endpoint, which means this part is also completed. At account 1, we have enabled the private DNS as well. So now, if I'll go to my Cloud Shell and if I'll try to access nginx.deploymasters.com, I should be able to see the result as well, right? And this is happening over a private link connection in AWS, right? So yeah, and if I'll do ns lookup nginx.deploymasters.com, it is resolving to a private IP, which is our VPC's IP, instead of a public IP. But it should never, it shouldn't be able to resolve to public IP because we haven't created any public record for this nginx.deploymasters.com, right?